Dear audience, welcome to today's lecture. My name is Uekötter. I teach environmental history and the history of technology here at Ruhr-Universität Bochum, Germany. And I would like to talk about other issues in today's lecture: climate change, loss of biodiversity, energy, large technology systems. These are the bread and butter topics that usually keep me busy here in Bochum. This lecture was held and recorded on November the 14th, 2024, a bit more than a week after Trump was declared the winner of the US presidential election. Neither Trump nor fascism is one of my specializations, but the topic keeps coming back to me. This is now the third lecture where I discuss whether Trump is a fascist. I gave the first lecture at the University of Birmingham on January the 18th, 2017, 2 days before his first inauguration. And the second lecture, How Fascist Was Trump, in November 2020, again, as an academic in Birmingham, England. And I hope that this would be the end of this lecture series. Now, this is part of a lecture series here at Ruhr-Universität Bochum. Today's session was meant to discuss entrepreneurs and their role in modern economic history. And in a way, we're still on this topic. I think businessmen play a significant and underrated role in the events that we have witnessed. And no, it's not a coincidence that entrepreneurs are on the agenda on this day. We will see whether the German government and other governments around the world are prepared for what might be in store. But I wish to mention here that this lecture series is prepared for Trump. Now, before you think that I give the same lecture now for the third time, that is not the case. And you can check that later if you wish, because the other presentations will be on my university website. And looking back at what I said 4 and 8 years ago, I do see changes in my argument and learning curves, and I've seen some ideas that have fallen flat. For example, I suggested in 2017 that Trump might seek to revive the construction fervor of fascist times, famously on display from the Pontine Marshes south of Rome to the plans for a new German capital, Welthauptstadt Germania, in the place of Berlin. It seemed possible at the time. After all, Trump is a real estate man who likes to put his name on buildings. And if you look at American infrastructure at that time, it was really in need of renovation. Well, as it turned out, Trump, in his first term, had no substantial interest in building anything beyond his personal fortune. So much so that Infrastructure Week turned into a running joke in Washington. Time and again, Trump would proclaim an upcoming Infrastructure Week, and then he was off to some other topics by Wednesday at the latest. So we don't have to discuss today whether the fascist builder will come back. And I say that both in order to set the record straight and in order to get you into the right mood. The election campaign is barely over. We all remember the warnings and the horror scenarios, the expectation of a world-shattering catastrophe. But as I start with my comments, it is a worthwhile effort to ignore cognitive and imagined certainties about what is coming, or at least to put them into perspective for the moment, difficult as it may be. Otherwise, we may easily end up in the intellectual equivalent of an arms race, something you can witness time and again in discussions of fascism. Given that there is so much that is so scary in so many ways, it is tempting to rush for drastic warnings in an arms race of this type. The first prize usually goes to the person who comes up with the darkest scenario and the most dramatic comment. And those who seek nuance will inevitably be on the defensive because they clearly did not understand the urgency of the matter. As an academic historian, it is my professional duty to point out that the future is open and that things can take unexpected turns. When it comes to Trump, the challenge is to make this point without looking totally ridiculous. True, Trump may change and turn into an emphatic person who appreciates ethnic diversity, but really you shouldn't put any money into such a scenario. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that white men are the only people who really count for Trump, and that he views all other humans as mere shades of Untermenschentum. History is open. But when I make this point, I think not so much about the mental world of Donald Trump, about which we know everything that we need to know. I think about the political and socioeconomic context. Now, there is an event that teaches us that history is open-ended, and that's the rule of the Nazis. No sensible person would have voted for Hitler in 1933 if he or she had known what Germany would look like 12 years later. But of course, that is not how we typically talk about fascism, and it is rewarding to start this talk with collective memory. In other words, with history as it is remembered, rather than history in terms of what actually happened. Fascism is the defining trauma of Western democracy, and surely the commemorative framework that shapes German politics. The narrative is about the fateful collapse of democracy, the path into the abyss, and the loud and unambiguous warning that fascism encapsulates for all time: never again. Now, it's easy to criticize this as a rather Eurocentric reading. After all, numerous democracies have collapsed around the world in different ways, and even more democracies are limping along, too strong to die, but far too weak to nurture a vibrant political culture. However, it seems that there is a lingering Western pride that prevents us from taking the experiences of other countries seriously, at least for the time being. That's a point that I'll come back to. Now, it's common to say that collective memory is dynamic and constantly changing, and I'm tempted to add that there is one notable exception: Holocaust memory. The genocidal crimes of the Nazis are the linchpin of collective memory for several decades now, and it seems as if commemoration is frozen in time. The debates of the 1990s about the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin and Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List ring eerily familiar nowadays, as if they had happened yesterday. Collective memory focuses on the atrocities, and to the extent that there is an alternative approach to collective memory, it is not about different frameworks or different narrative. It is about questioning what this has to do with our predicaments in the 21st century. So, to cut a long story short, there are two versions available for the commemoration of the Nazi past: an emphatic never again that highlights the regime's criminal nature, and a sentiment, albeit growing, that this is no longer living memory, that doesn't speak to issues of our day. There was a time when things were different. For much of the old Federal Republic, there were clashes over Nazi commemoration between the left and the right, mainly between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. The liberal FDP joined a bit later and was more reluctant in history debates, perhaps because it absorbed too many old Nazis in the post-war years. Well, the crimes of the Nazis were obviously known, but they hadn't yet to gain that pivotal role. In the early Federal Republic, it made much sense to look at the decline of democratic life prior to 1933 and at the first years of Nazi rule. After all, post-war politicians sought to build a new democratic polity, and the dissolution of the Republic of Weimar, to borrow Karl Dietrich Bracher's famous phrase, seemed to offer important clues as to what to avoid. This interest has largely subsided, and any discussion of Weimar Germany and the early Nazi era is now overshadowed by knowledge about what came next. As a result, actors typically fall into two categories: those who warned of the Nazis and tried to forestall the looming disaster, and those who failed and paved the way in one way or another for the Nazis. In collective memory, the Nazis are a glimpse into the abyss, more so than an opportunity to learn about the path into disaster. This is significant for the task at hand. If you try to make sense of Trump and fascism, you should look at the early years of Nazi rules and the years before, the time between, say, 1920 and 1938. That is where you find things that resonate: the efforts to preserve democracy and the rule of law, the consolidation of authoritarian structures, the demise of democratic participation. For the latter years, we can only speculate at this point. Maybe Trump will turn genocidal with his deportation fantasies, but we will not know until we see his plans, his efforts, and the camps that he may build, and whether it makes any sense to compare them to Nazi concentration camps. At the moment, we see Trump's authoritarian longings, his admiration for dictators, including those of the crackpot variety, his contempt for the rules and legal constraints at home and abroad. It does look eerily familiar if you look at the early years of Nazi rules, but that does not answer the question how to deal with these things. We certainly should not go for associative thinking, for parallelisms that seem to offer themselves. Back then, Hitler left the League of Nations. Now Trump will leave the Paris Agreement against climate change. That's a game that we can play ad nauseum. Maybe it makes you feel heroic for a moment, but that is the discount version of historical learning. The past as a duffel bag full of all sorts of events where you can pick anything and say, hey, that reminds me of something. It should be clear that this is historical learning on the cheap. And to the extent that it works, it only works with the converted. This is a basic point that I'd like to stress here and discuss with you. For me, Trump's victory is also a verdict about historical learning in the age of Twitter. You can always find some bit of information, or better yet, a video or a picture. You can get rid of all the context and a multitude of perspectives, then you give it the right spin, and out it goes into the digital swampsland. And there it is available for the electronic equivalent of Orwell's 2 Minutes Hate. You will always find something for any set of opinions that may be out there. And in case evidence is lacking, there is always an AI solution. But when it comes to Trump and these brief, flashy, pictorial indictments, I think the record is clear. That did not work. That did not make a difference. So in order to understand Trump and fascism, we need to do something that good historians do on a daily basis. Look at things in context. We need to connect the dots, investigate the frameworks for action, and look more closely. What are the conditions, the requirements, the means, the prospective consequences, and most crucially, how does this all fit together, or does it actually fit together? And if you do that for Trump, you can identify a few recurring issues. In fact, it's tempting to come up with a kind of fascism checklist that highlights some defining features: crucial enabling contexts, key factors for the rise to power, recurring assets that gave fascist rules its heft. And if you start compiling such a checklist, you come up with a rather clear result. Yes, there are a few things that resonate. There is reason for concern. But if you look at things in context and compare Trump with the historical record of fascism, we come up with the same assessment time and again. No, it's not the spring of 1933 yet. While we have evidence, let me go through my own laundry list. Dictatorial power. Trump's rule will be framed by the Constitution and the courts. It is unlikely that it can rule in a dictatorial manner as long as the Constitution is intact. Of course, the immunity decision of the Supreme Court is a judicial debacle in a system based on checks and balances, but it is nothing like the Enabling Act of 1933, the Ermächtigungsgesetz. Legislation will be passed along established rules. And as to the immunity ruling, it is significant to note that Trump may claim immunity for his own action, but this does not pertain to his staff, his secretaries, and his political allies. I will not be surprised to learn that Trump's staff members call their lawyers on a regular basis to make sure that they do not land in legal jeopardy. What about inflation? Well, the post-COVID increase of consumer prices certainly played a role for Trump's victory, but it's really a small change compared with the German inflation in 1923. Nobody lost a fortune from post-COVID inflation, and if people lose a fortune with crypto or some other digital scams, well, that will be on Trump's watch. And besides, two pillars of Trump's agenda, tariffs and mass deportations, are almost certain to have inflationary effects. Unemployment. The Nazis came to power in the wake of the Great Depression. Unemployment stood at 6 million, and few observers were confident that capitalism could grow itself out of this crisis. Today, America's economy is humming along, and unemployment figures are as low as they can be in a capitalist society in the 21st century. What about political opponents? Well, the Nazis thrived against the backdrop of Bolshevism. It's open to debate whether the specter of socialist revolution did exist in real terms, but there were socialists around. They did hope for a revolution, and nothing of this kind exists in our time. Woke Democrats arguing for transgender rights do not aim to expropriate your company or your real estate. What about racism? Well, that is a difficult one to make the comparison, as racism is always, in all its forms, ugly and silly. But unlike Trump, Hitler never said, "I'm not a racist, but." Trump also claimed to have been the best president for the black community since Abraham Lincoln. Now, for the record, I find that claim utterly ridiculous. But Hitler never claimed to have done anything for the Jewish community. What about the judiciary? Well, I think when we talk about the law and the courts, we're all children of the human rights revolution after 1945, and this really makes for a watershed in judicial terms. There is an ongoing and worrisome politicization of the American judiciary, which is much more a federalist society project than a Trump project, but I very much doubt that Trump will seek to trash the civil rights legislation. And quite a few Trump allies ended up in court during his first term. Michael Cohen, Rick Gates, Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, Paul Manafort. A court mandated the dissolution of Trump's charitable foundation while Trump was in the White House. Now, Hitler did not have a charitable foundation, but if he had had one, that foundation would have been safe from the courts. So, to cut a long story short, we are still quite a bit away from a world of der Führer schützt das Recht. And what about the overarching goal? Wait, make America great again. That may be a good campaign slogan, but it's pretty hollow when you compare it with the goals of the fascists. They knew what they wanted. Revising Versailles, rearmament, Lebensraum in the East. In Italy, fascism was very much about ruralization, sending people back from these cities into the countrysides. The fascists knew exactly what they wanted, and they acted accordingly. By way of comparison, there is a gaping intellectual hole at the heart of Trump's agenda, and I very much doubt that this will change in the next 4 years. During the first term, Trump showed a deep distrust of anyone who proposed an intellectual personal agenda, as seen in the constant rotation in staff members and political directives. And if I may say something on a personal note here, having spent 10 years in England, I'm quite familiar with right-wing populists who promise the moon and then muddle through in office with a long list of blunders. Now, in compiling such a checklist, it should be noted that there are some contexts that have changed over the last 8 years in ways that increase the similarity to fascism. For example, there is a change in the age profile of MAGA supporters. It used to be an old and exceedingly wide movement in the multicultural society, but that is changing. There is a notable increase in Trump's share of voters among young people, Blacks, and Latinos. There is still some way to go vis-à-vis the Nazis. As you may know, the Nazi movement drew a lot of its vigor from a cadre of young, academically trained professionals who moved into powerful positions early in lives. These men, yes, they were all men, these men were decisionists by nature, Männer der Tat, who saw legal and moral constraints as signs of weakness. So we have a cadre of young men who are MAGA enthusiasts, and they may turn into a liability for US democracy for decades, but they just cannot act with the kind of leeway that the Nazis offered. There is a second issue where things move into a worrisome direction: violence. Back in 2017, I pointed out that Trump had no troops of his own, nothing that would remotely resemble the SR or the SS. Things look a bit different now. There are a lot of right-wing militias who feel emboldened by Trump, most evidently on display in the insurrection of January the 6th, 2021. Now, these right-wing militias do not have clear hierarchies or chains of command, but that was a relative thing with the original fascist militants too. If we follow Sven Reichart's Faschistische Kampfbünde, a comparison of paramilitary units in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, you see groups of men who've thought first and foremost about their comrades and who do not feel obliged to wait for commands or instructions from above. It is deeply terrifying that even Nancy Pelosi's husband was not safe from a vicious attack, and a culture of violence is anathema to the spirit of democracy. If people no longer dare to speak up and run an election for office for fear of getting killed, it's game over for democracy. So, to summarize my arguments so far, there are parallels, but they typically tilt towards the original fascists. By way of comparison, Trump is much weaker, much more constrained, much less fascist than the fascists of the interwar years. In compiling my checklist, I found only two fields where things look more grim than the 1920s and 1930s. One is the media. The Weimar Republic surely did not collapse for lack of journalists or periodicals, and back then, readers were still familiar with the concept that you had to pay for news services. And second, there is now an international fraternity of right-wing populists and authoritarian regimes, unlike anything that we saw in the interwar years, surely aided by the digital tools of the age of social media. This international network surely helped Trump win this election, but it remains to be seen whether they are any help in governing. Putin, for one, does not have any interest in making Trump strong while in office. He needs a weak, confused US so he can continue with his domestic and international shenanigans. Adding to this argument, there is one dimension in Trump's rule that is without parallel in the interwar years: shameless self-enrichment. Say what you will about Hitler and Mussolini, but at least they never tried to cash in on their rule with a posh capital city hotel. In fact, their profit motive seems to be Trump's defining concern, along with his desire to stay out of jail. Now, it's not great to have people in power who seek to make money for themselves, but hey, if you have a choice between personal corruption and invading other countries in the quest for Lebensraum, well, I can tell you what I would prefer. So, to sum up my argument at this point, when we think about Trump as a fascist, that probably says more about collective memory than about real history similarities. It is easy to imagine the fascists of the 1920s laughing at someone like Trump. Too old, too lazy, too much talk, and too little action. Please remember that the original fascists were forged in countless fistfights with communists and other political enemies, down to verbal street battles. And if you want a great mental picture, it's easy to imagine that Trump would not have fared well in a street fight. Now, this obviously doesn't mean that Trump is harmless and no threat to democracy. Maybe the statement so far is that poverty of our historical imagination, where we only allow a scenario of collapse of democracy that is somehow similar to interwar fascism. Let me speak it clearly. It's time to ditch the Eurocentric hubris that only a few Western countries are allowed to see eye to eye with the US experience. Maybe Trump is something else, just the latest incarnation of a wave of crony capitalism that has plenty of precedents in world history. Rich men seeking office for personal gain. Ask any historian of Latin America, and you will hear, how many examples do you want? This brings me to my last point, which is essentially about a change in focus. In making sense of Trump and fascism, it is rewarding to approach this question not with a checklist, but in conceptual terms. In today's political discourse, fascism is more a slogan than a concept, but there was a time when that was different. And as I stand here on this podium, I imagine legions of communists, socialists, Marxists from the interwar years crying from their graves, Frank, when will you start talking about the obvious? Trump is a billionaire who teamed up with Elon Musk, currently the richest man on the planet. And there is a wider circle of filthy rich men, Peter Thiel, the man who made J.D. Vance, Jack Halber, Paul Malarkey, and plenty of hedge fund managers, Silicon Valley investors, and cryptocurrency fortune seekers. And looking at this rooster, I'm sure that Marxists of the interwar year would now scream at me, see, this is what we've always been talking about. Fascism as camouflage for the rule of bourgeois elites, a sign of desperation among the capitalists, that they're running out of steam and out of arguments. If the bourgeoisie can no longer convince the people, they resort to lies and fakeness. For Marxists of the interwar years, the case would have been clear. If the bourgeoisie supports a moron like Trump, capitalism has reached its final stage and the revolution will be just around the corner. We know how the stage theory of orthodox Marxism played out. History did not follow the script where capitalism transitions to imperialism, then on to fascism, and finally, after that revolution thing, to socialism. But does that make the basic idea obsolete? Fascism as camouflage for stark material interests, as a way to perpetuate a capitalist system that benefits primarily the rich, I do not think that idea is completely absurd. And I'm surprised that going through post-election commentary, there seems to be a notable reluctance to flag the power of rich men and their primary tool, bogus information circulating on social media. There was a lot of talk about Biden's age, the wave of inflation, the election campaign, high-minded, arrogant liberals, but few people talk about the big money that backed Trump. A notable exception was Michael Hanfeld in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, revealingly not in the politics section, but the feuilleton section. Was it really a coincidence that the momentum of the Harris campaign broke at the time when Elon Musk became a visible Trump supporter? I doubt that most US voters remained immune from the nonsense circulating in the social media. And no, online nonsense is not a force of nature. It is made and enabled by capitalists. I find it deeply terrifying that a few billionaires with their digital tools can heap scorn on any politician they do not like in a manner that may tilt elections. What makes us silent about the power of billionaires? Have we become so used to disinformation that we no longer view it as worthy of attention? Is it the reluctance of stressing an aspect that absolves the Harris campaign? Is this the insider view of political animals who find it hard to understand the worldview of people who spend much time on social media? Or is this simply about the aversion to everything that smacks of Marxism? If it is later, let me go on record as someone who is currently doing a lecture series on capitalism that trashing Marxism is an act of intellectual self-castration. So you may talk about Trump as a fascist in the sense that orthodox Marxism proposed, as a ruthless capitalist who can manipulate people to such an extent that they vote against their own material interests. We may keep doing so until we see Trump acting in the interest of normal people. Of course, this argument is open to criticism, but I think the criticism is not so much about the concept. Why should embattled capitalists refrain from confusing people's mind? Criticism should focus on the context. This is clearly not about fascism in its time, to cite Ernst Nolte's famous book, but fascism at a time when a lot has changed since the heydays of Marxism. Situations of this kind are ripe with tensions or contradictions, Gleichzeitigkeit des Ungleichzeitigen for the Germans in the room. And I wish to flag, by way of concluding, 5 points that matter for the future of this fascist project. First, we're talking about fascism without the Bolshevist opponent. Of course, Trump called Harris a Marxist during the debate, but I doubt that a significant part of the viewers took that serious. It seems ridiculous to talk about an upcoming anti-capitalist revolution nowadays, and that makes for a world of difference. The stage theory of Marxism is dead. Second, capitalists do not work as one, something that was always one of the key errors of the socialists. Marxism depicted the capitalists acting in a class, in sync, and in light of their own common interest to forestall the revolution. That was arguably always little more than a fever dream of class warriors back in the days, and it's certainly not true now. Businessmen are dyed-in-the-wool individualists who pursue their own personal interests, never mind the interests of others who are also billionaires. Donald Trump and Elon Musk seek to enrich themselves, and any idea that they act on behalf of others or collective interests is laughable. So this is not a conspiracy of fascists. It is more about a federation of interests, a temporary meeting place of crass individualists, and the centrifugal forces in this arrangement may become visible very soon. Third, fascism emerged in a time of crisis when many saw capitalism as moribund. Hitler could pursue his policy of autarky and rearmament in an economic setting where nothing else seemed to work, where world trade had collapsed, and where 6 million were out of work. There is nothing of that kind in contemporary America. The economy may not be perfect. There is the burning issue of fairness and the distribution of gains. But a lot of people and a lot of capitalists are heavily invested in a booming economy based on a transnational division of labor, and they will respond if Trump pursues his autarky vision. In fact, it is likely that the stock market will respond immediately, just as it did during Trump's first term when he saw the stimulus response medal at work in his trade war. The stock market tanked whenever Trump imposed tariffs, prompting Trump to walk back for a moment. And it is entirely open whether Trump will show more stamina in the second term. Trump and stamina are not two words that come up in the same sentence very often. Now, just to be clear, technically, this is perfectly possible. The United States can produce most of its stuff domestically, but any rewards of autarky politics will be long-term, while the damage will be immediate. Unlike Hitler, Trump cannot impose a new economic approach without severe penalties. My fourth point, Trump will be head of a government with significant financial liabilities. The US federal government is effectively an insurance company with an army. Its expenditures are about the military and about covering the risks of life, disease, age, disability, veterans. These entitlements are hugely expensive and hugely popular. I make this point in light of running fantasies about rebuilding the federal government, perhaps under the leadership of Elon Musk. Of course, there is room for improvement in a large organization like the US government. Every large organization has room for improvement. I know that. I work in a large organization myself. But of course, the Ruhr-Universität is perfect as it is right now. My dean is in the room. But really, if you look at the US government as it is, for all the improvement that possible, there is no way to make drastic changes without deep cuts in entitlements or higher taxes. This would seriously constrain Trump's range of options, even in the absence of a cliff. And the upcoming cliff is known to everybody who can do the maths. The Social Security Trust Fund, which is about the federal pension that all people in the US are entitled to, the Social Security Trust Fund will be depleted at some point in the next 10 years. And in the absence of either new taxes or a new way of funding, federal pension payments will go down immediately by at least 20%. I very much doubt that Americans will fail to recognize a fall in the pensions of that degree. But then I don't use social media much, and maybe we will have an AI application that can successfully gaslight pensioners who run out of money. Who knows? My fifth and final point, if we view Trump as a fascist in terms of Marxist orthodoxy, we should not lose sight of one crucial point. fascism did not prove sustainable anywhere. We have long dictatorships in world history. We have one-party rule over decades, but fascism never did last. It seemed to have an innate tendency to burn out. Mussolini was killed. Hitler committed suicide when the military situation was hopeless. And in Spain and Portugal, the fascist regime effectively died with Franco and Salazar. Fascism divorced itself. And the only question is what will burn down in the conflagration. There is the Berlin bunker version, which I really find hard to get out of your mind when you listen to Trump's dark speeches over the last months. If you take that seriously, it feels as if, Trump's fascism goes straight from 1933 to April 1945. But maybe things will follow a different script. Let me close by recounting the fate of Antonio de Salazar, the dictator who ran Portugal over 4 decades. Salazar ruled longer than any other fascist dictator, but his reign came to an end when he suffered a stroke in 1968, incidentally due to a collapsing desk chair in his vacation home in Estoril near Lisbon. He fell into a coma, his entourage set up a new government, and then something unexpected happened. Salazar awoke from his long sleep. He was obviously fit to govern, but nobody dared to tell him that he was no longer in power. So as a result, the new regime put up a show for Salazar. Everybody behaved as if Salazar was still running the country, down to regular cabinet meeting done especially for him, parallel to the real cabinet meeting. And so it went until Salazar finally died from an unrelated illness some 2 years later. Maybe that is how things will go with Trump. He will do the trash talking that we were all sadly familiar with, and his entourage will run the country confident that the ailing child king will not notice that others have taken control. Now, I doubt that this would be good for either America or the world, but it wouldn't be fascism anymore. Maybe that will be a good moment to put obsession with the ghosts of the 20th century into perspective. The word crony capitalism may not scare us in the same way as fascism for the foreseeable future, but we really will not get very far in a global and unpredictable 21st century if we limit our historical imagination to a handful of countries that are worthy of comparison with, well, the West or what's left of it. And to conclude on a somewhat positive note, we don't have to constrain our historical imagination in this way. Crony capitalism may be the most widespread type of capitalism globally. So there are really plenty of countries that provide opportunities to learn about the corrosive effects on civil society, political life, economic growth. It's just that we've never witnessed crony capitalism in a country that served as a pillar of the world economy. Okay, maybe this wasn't really a positive ending of this story, but hey, what did you conclude from a lecture entitled How Fascist Is Trump? Thanks for your attention.